Okay. So welcome everyone to the CHAOSS Funding Impact Measurement Working Group for June 4th. As always, we are under the CHAOSS Code of Conduct, so keep that in mind. Please be kind to each other. We have, I think, an interesting agenda today. We have an interesting speaker, so I can't wait to turn it over to Emma to talk a little bit about funding impact and some of the work that she's done over the years at Microsoft, other places. And I think that Emma has some really interesting perspectives on the pluses and minuses of funding and the impact that it can have on maintainers and on projects. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Emma. Do you have slides you wanted to share?
I do not. I mean, I thought it was a little bit more informal, but I certainly have an outline if that's okay. Sorry if I maybe I should have brought some, but I can certainly talk in an arc if that's okay.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Some people use slides, some people don't.
Yeah,
It's
I usually do. I
either
usually
way.
do.
So.
Yeah, I was as part of my introductions, hi, I'm Emma. I was laid off from Microsoft about 3 weeks ago, so my schedule is totally different. Like normally I'd be at my desk thinking about oh, I should have a deck for that, but instead I've been out in nature and not at my computer. So that's part of my failure is also my benefit that I'm out being in nature so much. So yeah. So a bigger background other than my current kind of lack of structure is yeah, I've been part of the open source community for 20 plus years, as we say when we hit 20 years. I started off as a developer, and that was something that I just was drawn to and really loved, and worked in. I was very lucky to experience my first job at like I guess what's now a startup, but we're just building with lots of different technology. And we were kind of early adopters of open source. And so I was really able at very early in my career to start to build, like have comparative, this comparative experience of building with proprietary software to the community and the opportunity to ask questions and to contribute of open source. And early on that was like MySQL and PHP and Drupal. I think Drupal was one of my very favorite communities. And I just started to see that, like, for the funding connection, the importance of the contribution piece, whether it was like the various pieces that come together. um in I started to kind of gravitate towards teaching other people about open source, and that brought me to Mozilla, where I worked on the open innovation team and the community team and the various incarnations of what it meant to make projects and their communities successful. I worked there for a number of years, and also on a project called Social Coding for Good, which was all about matching contributors with projects like Wikimedia and MIFOs and a bunch of other things. So I for a very long time I've been thinking about how to make open source projects successful, largely through contribution, but that just funding being really just a type of contribution, really at the end of the day. And then started over at Microsoft about 5 years ago in their open source programs office. And at the time I saw that as a really great opportunity to kind of be in the trying to think in the engines that had the most influence one of the most influence in the world in open source. And so that was both an honor and a learning experience about that. And yeah, I live on Vancouver Island in Canada. So that's a long introduction to myself. I just do that to say, like, I care very deeply about open source. I have worked with a lot of people thinking about how open source can be more successful, and I personally credit open source with my own success. So I just don't think I would be where I am if I hadn't had the opportunities that I had and the mentorship that I had and met the people that I had. So I'm all in. I've drank the Kool-Aid. So on the funding piece, so like the history of that, of course, the contribution I mentioned, but also when I worked at Mozilla, we had a program there called the Mozilla Open Source software support program. It was MOSS. Anyways, I sometimes forget the acronyms like we do with CHAOSS. And I've been part of the CHAOSS community for a long time as well. I just think it's probably one of the, if not the best open source community right now. I just think it's a great place to turn up and to learn. And I think it's a great example of how to run an open source project. So drank that Kool-Aid too. Yeah, the Mozilla open source program, I was part of the committee there. So the way that program worked was that we had, I think it was 3 different streams at the time. There was one focused on security and open source through funding, foundational software through funding. So that's the things that Mozilla was using. And then I think third, we had one just focused on India. So we're trying to get out of our kind of North American bubble and think about the emerging industries at the time. And it was run by, so there was quite a big investment at the time. I think it was one of the first real programs, honestly, correct me if I'm wrong, Dawn, that started to really say, like, we should be supporting our dependencies. And we had a grant program manager. We had a committee for each of those 3 tracks. And I was on one of the committees. I think it's funny how important details you forget. I was on the foundational software committee, and even further beyond the committee that reviewed the applications by open source projects, because it was a grant application. There had to be an internal nominee at Mozilla that said, yes, this project is important. I think that it would, I can vouch for, we're not fostering a toxic or notorious or, any of those types of things that you also want to avoid giving money to. So there's just a lot of checks and balances in that program. I also helped build diversity inclusion, open inclusive governance checklist that we started asking every project to go through, is largely based on the CHAOSS metrics around inclusive leadership, governance, and there's just a few other things that I have that, and I can share that later if anyone's interested. It's in a repo somewhere. And what we found, what we were able to show impact there was that we asked people to go through that checklist and make optionally some change as part of the application process. And we found 80% of people made some change. And it was just, sometimes it was just making sure they had a code of conduct, or that they documented how their leadership worked, or all these types of things. And so we saw that as a win, because regardless of award, there is some change happening. So that's just some background on my experience there. Around COVID, I think that all shut down as a project, which made me sad, because I thought that it was kind of a leading example. I've also worked, so when I came to Microsoft, something that I picked up there was the FOSS Fund, which you may or may not be familiar with. It was started by Dwayne O'Brien at Indeed, and it's just a program internal to companies. So there's actually a FOSS Funders, fossfunders.com. Again, I should have had slides, but it's a group of companies that kind of came together around Dwayne's this project of FOSS Fund. And it's pretty lightweight. It's not a grant program. There's not an application process. There's it has 2 goals. The first was to build an internal culture around contributing to open source. So we asked for nominees from employees, similar to the grant program at Mozilla, but not dependent on only employees. So FOSS Fund, the nominees came from employees. The grant program, it had to come from the project. So that's just one difference. And then we would run once quarterly a ballot of those nominations for employees to vote on. And in order to vote, employees have to have contributed to open source in some way. We largely looked at GitHub activities, but also we allow people to self-attest on things that aren't caught on GitHub, like similar to what CHAOSS does. And we would award 30K a month. So 120K a year, not huge, especially for a company, $1 trillion company. But it was, like I said, partially cultural building. Like, you only get a ballot if you contribute to open source. It just raises awareness of the companies. We care about this. This is not something you need to hide that you contribute. You'll actually be rewarded. And then we were awarded those funds. There's different incarnations of how those were awarded, but the last ones that I was running was 10K for the first, 5K for 2.5K. Now that was originally that's kind of the standard FOSS fund that Indeed, Bloomberg, NVIDIA, I think Target. There's just a bunch of us in that group that were running something similar, something we started to do after that, and I'll get to impact soon. I'm just trying to like show how we were running these first. Something that we started to do was ask ourselves, well, there's some symptoms in that nominations start to slow down. We start to see employees nominating, projects they knew, and it went from, 80 nominations in the original FOSS Fund one, I think it was really called, to maybe two turning up, like just not many. And I don't think that's so much apathy in the uh, employee group, but just knowledge, like who needs it. Like they only know kind of what's in front of them sometimes, or sometimes what's popular, or even what they see out on the internet. A maintainer yelling about stuff sometimes got people's attention. Like it wasn't very strategic, it wasn't based on metrics, and sometimes we'd end up with a list of projects that would be wildly different, like some little tiny Rust crate against open SSL. Like we didn't really have, and so open SSL would largely win because the voters knew that, and so we just started to see the disparity in and the slowing down of nominations, and that we really couldn't necessarily speak to why, how that first place winner used that money. And we just didn't have anything beyond the brand value, really. Be able to say we awarded this, yay, and the maintainer would be happy. And there's nothing wrong with that, I don't think, either, right? Like maintainer's happy, that there's something to that, but it's hard as a business manager also to say, like, here's how we helped our dependencies. It's more secure. They're able to pay one of their contributors, or like all these different things that make a project sustainable. And so we started to experiment with, I get what internally at Microsoft we called rubrics, but in the CHAOSS project you would refer to as metrics models. We use the term rubrics because that's a word that PMs and VPs who are not in the ecosystem just understand as a pass fail or a good grade, right? So we, in the end of probably around this time last year, and there's a blog post on that too, I can share some of these links afterwards, we applied a set of metrics that represented what we thought the Nebraska cartoon represented. So you're familiar, everyone's, especially in this group, is familiar with that cartoon. So we looked at all of our dependencies. We internally we have a database that holds our like millions of dependencies, and queried them based on a number of things: highly used by Microsoft and or by the ecosystem, one maintainer. So we use some criteria. And there's actually the pseudocode linked in the blog post too, if you actually just want to get into exactly what we did, including the use of ecosystems data. So yeah, one maintainer, and we looked at the email address, I think, largely. It didn't work for company was logging in with their personal email, that kind of thing. There's a few things there I forget exactly. So I think maybe there was a slowing of response time, or maybe that was an ambition for us still. But anyway, so these criteria to identify what we thought were some examples of Nebraska projects, but not necessarily. Maybe I'll get into that too. And let me know, Dawn, if I run out of time talking, because I do enjoy this topic. Yeah, so and we ended up with a first group, and we went through it, and we were like, no, that person's super famous and is fun. Like we had to do some qualitative like viewing of this, and we also made sure that they could take GitHub sponsors, and that was less about Microsoft technology, and that it's just super fast for us. We didn't want to get bogged down. We sometimes find the payment processes first. Two I can think of right now are GNU Toolchain and LLVM. Sometimes took months to pay those two, just through the procurement process, and so that's hard with budgets, right? Because you're trying to tell your finance person this is going to be in this quarter, but for us, GitHub sponsors, we could do it under a month, and that would help us stay there. So So yeah, I think we sponsored 175, 178 maintainers in that one. We caught some of your popular maintainers that maybe like Jay Harb, I think is, arguably a famous single maintainer, one maintainer, and I'm not sure that, but that's okay. That's also okay. And we also managed to kind of avoid the usual candidates, which was one of our goals. We don't want to just keep funding. Well, we do want to keep funding the same people. We want to reach further, right? We want to find those that don't automatically spring to people's minds as nominations, that don't automatically, sort of come to the top of the list. And I think we achieved that a little bit, and it definitely taught us how to do better. We were able to say to our leadership, this is the metric, like we use this, we care about this. But the thing we weren't really able to at the end of the day say is like what the impact was. Again, even though we know that we're helping projects that have these attributes, we weren't able to say this changed, or and being $1 trillion company, you can't, it was hard to find the language to say like, did you do anything with, like that would be totally inappropriate. And so it's a little bit elusive at that point, how to show leadership. And not because, and you all probably know this, it's not because it's like, oh, we need the project to prove that, but we want to get more money, we want to get bigger budgets, right? And I think for me that was the motivation to talk about the impact, was so that we could give more and have a broader impact. So that was the experiment with rubrics, and we continued that a little bit in the last two FOSS funds. We actually not donated, but contributed our FOSS fund money to the GitHub open source secure fund. And the reason why was really related to this impact question again, because like the Mozilla FOSS fund, the GitHub open source secure fund is run by a program manager, like has all of those resources, has relationships with projects. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about the relationship piece as well, where they were starting with a baseline of security. And they will be announcing all the results, which I think are really fantastic, I think later in this year. So I don't have any exact data on that, but I know that they're able to take a baseline. They worked with maintainers who opted in, because it's not anyone telling maintainers what to do with funding or time, but that was provided to them at their opt-in. And then they also got the funds. So what the funds were not used for those things necessarily, but it was like a supplementary to the funds. And I think they have some pretty good numbers to show as a result of that process. Now, very hands-on. Is it sustainable as a program over time? I'm not sure. But the fact that they were able to show impact on like OpenSSS scorecards and through that program, that's pretty cool. And definitely companies care about security. And so, I feel like that's one of the first experiments where that I've been able to show my leadership, look, these are the projects we nominated, this is what their baseline was, and here's where they are now. So those are internal numbers still to Microsoft, but at some point there'll be some average. I don't know how you communicate security metrics. You got to be careful, right? So so there's the impact of talking about like applying metrics to your dependencies and funding them. Then there's the GitHub open source secure fund. Something else that across FOSS funders we were starting to, and it just breaks my heart that I can't finish this, but we were trying to come together as a group to solve this problem that we experienced, which was, Microsoft, I'm using OpenSSL as an example across these, but it's not, they're not really a worry. We're all funding the same projects across all those FOSS funders. So not only, internally to our organization where we kind of likely candidates, we weren't being more strategic about it, but across every fund, we're all funding the same projects because our employees are all in the same ecosystems and we all wanted to get better at that. So we were having a conversation with Alpha Omega. So I'm not sure how familiar folks are with Alpha Omega, but they're a foundation. I think they're a branch off of OpenSSF, but we have someone at Microsoft that is on the board there. and they get lots of money uh, and to work on security things. And something that we proposed to them was trying to create a lightweight version of what GitHub is doing. Yeah, thank you for the link. By let me just gather my thoughts on this one. I have a doc I can share on this too. So something that alpha, there's a theory going around, or theory, or that we should get better at curating our dependencies according to a set of metrics. So when I mentioned the Nebraska, like that might be a curation of our dependencies, or called Nebraska dependencies. There might be a curation called, small and inactive, a curation of dependencies called, like there's a million different ways we can cut and slice our dependencies, but that we would start to, across companies, look at how we can have impact on those curations rather than each of us doing the same thing in our same silos. So we were starting to tackle this idea of creating curations of shared dependencies. I'll just use the Nebraska again because it's the easiest one. Where maybe at the end of the day, we have a list of Python, and we're working with ecosystems as well, a list of Python Nebraskas, for example. We didn't get to our list exactly. We would work with Alpha Omega to curate that list in a secure space because we don't want hackers to know what our Nebraska Python list is. And we would start to, Microsoft, Indeed, Capital One, we would all start to invest in each one of those separately. So we divide and conquer in a way. And the impact would be in two parts. The first would be just the money. The second would be, we would provide in some capacity an employee as the relationship person on behalf of the company or the FOSS funders group, depending on how we, I'm hoping this makes sense, but so in theory, here's how a new FOSS fund, the FOSS fund I was hoping to run this month would have gone. We have a list of 5 Python projects that are Nebraska projects. People vote for them, but when they vote, they're also asked, would you like to be the relationship person for this project, and work with Alpha Omega? Alpha Omega is like, we will train your person, we will bring them together with others from other companies, and we will create this kind of like committee and community of people who have relationships with open source projects and who we are like actively tracking the progress of through some metrics like security. People would self-nominate. Microsoft right now has a lot of layoffs, as I'm evidence, and just the industry. So we don't really know how that would have gone. Like if people would have actually felt like they had the empowerment of their managers, but I suspect some people would have, who were just embedded in open source. And then when we awarded the FOSS fund, we would have said, hey, you've won $10,000 and this person. And this person is going to meet with you once a month to check in and see how you're doing. That person would also get career training through Alpha Omega at no cost to the company. And we would sort of track the metrics over time. Alpha Omega does a lot of auditing, and they would just step in if things were needed. All, of course, if the maintainer was open to it. So that was a little convoluted, but I only share that because to kind of try and wrap things up to like funding impact. I think I'm highly skeptical that dollars to project are ever really impactful beyond reputation, and it depends on how many dollars, I guess. Because it's really hard to track. We don't know that the impact is on the things that actually make a project sustainable. We just don't know, and it's really, really hard. I have run queries of folks we've funded for FOSS Fund and asked if you are willing to share, how to use the funds. And we heard things like, I want to distribute them, but I don't have the governance, and I'm worried about people, and it's just sitting there. As one example, someone else, used it on a logo, which is great for their project, but for my business managers, saying that our dependency has a new logo doesn't really get me more dollars. And so I think my hypothesis is that we really need the qualitative, the people in the middle. We need to look at building relationships with maintainers and not, I think impact is really hard without that person in the middle. I think that's why GitHub Open Source Security Fund will show some success there because there are people involved. It's a very heavy-handed, if that's the word, expensive way of doing it. I don't think it will be sustainable over the long run just because of how these things work. But yeah, so maybe I'll just stop there. I'm not really skeptical of funding itself. I'm skeptical. Obviously, I think we should fund open source, but I'm skeptical that we can track impact without there being some person representing an organization like Alpha Omega or FUS funders in the middle to work with the maintainer and see what they need and adjust accordingly. And that's hard at scale, but I think if the industry worked together more like we were trying to do in FOSS funders, stop working in silos, that it's possible. Hopefully that all makes sense. I'll just stop there. And sorry I didn't have slides because I could have probably made some good ones, but yeah, I'll just lean on my rogue life right now.
Hey, yeah, no worries. We don't require slides. It's still
I like
a
making
really
slides though, and
interesting
I'm
conversation.
disappointed for me as much as anything.
No, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. And you know, the point you raised kind of at the end is something I think a lot of us are thinking a lot about. You know, I do a little tiny bit of work to help select sovereign tech fund projects. And one of the advantages they have is that people are applying for the funding. So they're saying
Yeah.
exactly how they're going to use it.
Hmm.
In some cases, you know, some of these applications, they're planning to use the funding for stuff that maybe isn't going to benefit the project long term or make it more sustainable. So do you favor the projects that are working on things like CI/CD systems and security and stuff that's going to have a longer term effect on the project than say maybe a logo, for example. Um, but but on the other hand, you know, one of the things we know is that when you fund certain things like security in particular, people will tend to work on it for the period that they have the funding for it, and then what happens? And so while I love these like the FOSS Funders program, the Sovereign Tech Fund, even you know programs like NGI Commons,
Hmm.
they really are kind of temporary funding mechanisms. And so these
Yes.
projects have to continue to find a way to either sustain this funding so that they can sustain the work that they're funded to do, or sometimes that work stops. And that's a real challenge. And it's something that we're trying to figure out how to better measure the impact of.
Yeah. Um, that's true. I mean, eventually, like sustainability means for the long term, right? And how do we, and working with more foundations, I think is key. Um, I- and like using the logo example, I know that Alyssa Wright over at Bloomberg, like her FOSS fund lives more in social good, so they care
Mhm.
less about that, right? That make the project is happy, right? Or there's some good that's come. I live in a business org, so it's different. I think it's also fair to say the impact is, or the security matters top for where I am, but yeah.
Yeah, and Bloomberg, I think they're still a privately held company, correct? I think that they have a different pressures than other companies.
Yeah.
And they can get away with the making it look more like charity or social good than a lot of companies with shareholders can get away with.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I had a comment. Who has a question? I did the whole I have a comment, not a question thing. Kaylin, go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Don. Thank you so much, Emma, for coming and sharing insights from throughout your career, especially during this time, which must be quite hectic for you. So really appreciate that. I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about how the FOSS Fund also served the purpose of building culture within the organization, because I've known about FOSS funds for years, but never thought of them as having that internal purpose or function. So I was really, yeah, so I was curious just to learn more about your experience of building up that internal open source culture via the FOSS Fund activity. And the second question is, you said that in order to be able to vote, the internal employees had to be open source contributors. And I wondered if you understood open source contributors to only be code contributors, or whether you also considered people who did, social roles, volunteering, event organization, or things like that.
Yeah, it's just saying the first one around culture. I mean, I joke with the $1 trillion company, but there are lots of people inside of Microsoft and companies that care very deeply about open source, and they're just giving their all the time, like to make a difference through the company. And so it's culture building, but it's also like giving a path for those folks to achieve some of the things they want to do. On the question about code contribution, yes. Non-code contribution. I'm just gonna get a document. We track people would get a ballot based on, I'm looking for a link at the same time as talking, sorry. Based on GitHub activity, but we had a self-attestation form internally where people would get a voting form if they just said what they contributed in the qualifying period. It could be anything. We didn't even really, as long as it wasn't to their own internal Microsoft project. That we have actually had folks being like, oh, well, I'm contributing this, like that's a Microsoft project. That doesn't count. So there's a link here that I created a long while ago now, but it's called 8 Ways You've Probably Already Contributed to Open Source, or you can contribute to open source today. And so some of just to get people thinking about not just what they could do, but what they might have already done. Because I think it's a two-way problem. Like we don't always track that properly, or companies don't always think about non-code contribution, but people don't always think about what they're doing that's not code as a contribution. So it works, to give people a little bit of a shake, like you have contributed, like you're on a board, or you gave this talk. So I think that's education too. Hopefully that answers your question.
Oh,
There's also some other links in there. There's a inclusion checklist. I think that actually links the GitHub, the Mozilla one. It looks like I snuck that in there. I didn't realize. That's in the Microsoft FOSS Fund list. You can just see in the README a bunch of stuff that are around culture building. It was really interesting. I'll just say though that a lot of times when we run a FOSS fund, it would almost inevitably get blowback from someone that thought we missed something or shouldn't be including something, or it became a heat magnet for people's disgruntledness around how the company manages open source. And I think that's true, not just at any company, but in the way that was good, because then they had a way to make the fund better, or like next time they know to nominate that project. So it had a good visibility in the company.
Yeah, and open source projects are complex, right? So it's hard to make these decisions, because you weight things differently based on your experience, or some nuanced thing going on in the project. And so these funds it's really hard to pick the right projects and be able to defend those choices when somebody's concerned about them.
Yeah, we have an internal list. We would run the nominees through that first, just to make sure there's no PR things, like that we should know about. It was very rare that turned up, or check for license changes, because license changes do happen. What else would I check for? I'd make sure that there is the way that funds are directed are publicly documented in a project's governance. If not, I would ask for that to be stood up before we awarded a project. And that was just to make sure that the community was fully on board and aware of where funds go, because we don't want to get in the middle of a dispute between the community and where the funds have been directed. So that's either a funding YAML, or just the GitHub sponsors panes, or some other governance doc. At Mozilla, I have experienced that funds going to communities can be mishandled, and that isn't just a very bad scene to sort out. So try and avoid that at all costs.
Other questions for Emma?
Yes, I do have one. So it seemed like, Emma, that kind of you came to the conclusion that there will need to be kind of a middleman, a middle person who's able, which allows us to track and measure the funding impact. And so I was wondering what were the kind of pathways or and kind of dead ends that you saw that made you come to this conclusion. So were there attempts that you saw where they were trying to measure the impact and it didn't work out as expected?
Yeah, I'm just gonna share a link here. Anyone with the link? I'm just pasting this. It's very like bare bones. I've had to it's no longer Microsoft specific, but it'll give you some idea, first of all, of what we were thinking about with Alpha. If you're curious, it was never tested, but it's what we were thinking about for how to put a person, an employee, a FOSS funder employee into the funding stream as a enduring relationship builder or something like that. And some of the problems we're trying to solve from that. And then your question was, oh my gosh, I forgot. I haven't forgotten your question. Do you mind just repeating it just so I get back to where my brain was there?
Yes, no worries. So I was just wondering whether you can tell us examples of different pathways of measuring impact, which kind of led
Right.
to that end, which made you conclude that we need a middle person.
Yeah, so the ways that we've tried, I'm also getting you a link to answer this question. Yeah, I'll try and get the link after. I'm not very good at multitasking screens. So I'm thinking it's less that we tried something, is that we just didn't have it yet. And I don't think anyone has it yet, to be even more down in the dumps about it. You know, we created this like Nebraska cohort of projects, and that allows us to say like what type of project with what type of risks we were looking to have impact on, but it didn't allow us to actually tackle one of those risks, right? We weren't able to get a new maintainer for any of those projects. We weren't, or we don't know that happened. And so maybe it's like we just don't have a mechanism to track that impact like a grant program would. FOSS just doesn't have that. At Mozilla, we did have more of the application process. There were milestones we checked in, and sometimes projects dropped their milestones, and then they just didn't get the rest of the funding because that happened. But you know, so I think grant programs tend to be successful, but I think just funds to project, that's the part I think is impossible. Not that you can't have a grant program with some goal of impact and that projects participate. I think that's what GitHub open source sponsors, that's what Moss Fund, that's what Sovereign Tech Fund, I think, you know, they're all doing that. But you know, sort of the push to just fund open source, maybe I'm just spicy because I have no employer right now. I think it's naive and it's unfair, because I don't think we can just throw money at things any more than you can any problem in society, right? Just throwing money at a thing doesn't work. You need to have a programmatic, strategic approach to get there, or other things can happen. And I mean that out of like love for the problem, right? Like I want to get to, I'd love to get to, you know, and maybe that's why foundations are more successful, maybe that because they're willing to invest in that. And you know, I really like this Alpha Omega and FOSS Funders idea, because it removed the everything from companies. I mean, we worked at companies, but we're working with Alpha Omega, which was a nonprofit who was given funds to solve a specific problem. I think that's the way to go. But it's not necessarily that we've tried anything and failed. Like I did learn from asking like surveys of FOSS funders that folks had, you know, the governance issues. I don't know how to pay one contributor, not another. In some ways, we were handing down the problem to maintainers. Like, you know, we don't know who to fund or how to have impact. You do it. And then they're like, well, I don't know how to, like, you know, and then maybe they give it to one of their contributors. It's sort of like a hot potato in a way. Everyone wants to help everyone, but like without the more structure. yeah, it doesn't happen. And then what else would I say about that? What else did I hear? You know, people would say, yeah, I could use another maintainer, but then I had no mechanism in the company to go find another, you know, what do you do with information you get is another question. Like, you know, just because someone shares that with you, what do you do? And I think it's just sort of the, you know, that maybe that's something for your group to think about. If there's funding impact and a maintainer says, I need another maintainer, what do you do? You're not part of the community. Like, what foundation is willing to work with you on that one? This is where I hope like Alpha Omega or someone like that can fill in and be like, well, let's figure out how to do that. Let's get this project a maintainer. By the way, that's YAML would like a maintainer, not just a random project. Yeah, so I wish sometimes I don't have answers here and I just have frustrations, but I just think it's the less structure we put around the funding, the less impactful we can be.
Awesome. Thank you, Emma. I think on that note, we have not quite 5 minutes left. So there are just a couple of things I want to mention, which are in the notes. We're going to have no meeting on June 18th. So we've decided to cancel it because a lot of us are going to be at the UN OSPO event. So we're going to skip that meeting. We'll pick back hopefully up on July 2nd. I'm not sure how many US folks will be here that week, but we'll see how that works. And on the research slide series, so Paul wasn't able to come today, but he did confirm that he will be presenting on the slide series on the 2nd of July. Adrian, thank you for volunteering to do July 16th. And anyone else who wants to do one in the future, we still need a speaker for July 30th. And then we'll also work on getting the speaker series, which is like what Emma just did here. Because as a reminder, the research updates, they're just like a 10-minute, I read this or wrote this research paper and here are some highlights. So those are just quick 10-minute presentations. They're nothing too intensive. And then just a series of reminders as always. So there's Open Source in the EU event in Warsaw on the 11th. The UN Open Source Week, which I mentioned earlier, is the 16th through the 20th of June. And the Sovereign Tech Agency is planning a maintain-a-thon and another side event on Friday. So last I heard, they're still working on those. I haven't checked in on those. And then the following week is the Open Source Summit North America. So we do have a few interesting talks there. We have a panel on funding. So that's going to be Georg Link and I with Andrew Nesbitt and unconfirmed speaker who will be fabulous, assuming her boss doesn't say no. So that should be interesting. And then Open Source Summit Europe, the talk acceptances and sadly rejections just went out. So that event will be in the last week of August in Amsterdam. Okay. Anything else? Any other quick reminders or anything else we should be thinking about in the last 2 minutes that we have left? Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Emma. This was super, super interesting. And feel free to drop links into the notes later if you have
Thanks
any.
for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And you're always welcome. So we do these every other week. So we'd love to
Yeah,
have
no, yeah.
after you get tired of wandering around the woods in your free
When
time.
the weather turns.
We'd be happy to help you.
I want to say thanks, Emma, for introducing a new format of presentation. I really personally enjoyed like the candid, like let's get right around in a circle and just I'll share my experiences and
Good. I haven't
insights.
actually done that before, so thank you for your openness around that.
Yeah, well, because what we want to do in this working group is just create a space where folks interested in or working on funding can come together and yeah, exchange insights and kind of build knowledge together. So thanks.
Yeah, very welcome. Thank you for the warm welcome. Have
All
fun
right.
at the UN.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you again on July 2nd. Take care.